Well, welcome to another episode of the Thought Leaders series with Student Garden. Super excited today to be joined by Luckmika Perera. Luckmika, welcome.
Thank you very much, George.
So maybe before we kind of get stuck into it, Luckmika, if you could tell us a little bit about your role. I think you've got maybe one of the best business unit names I've ever heard in a higher education context, which is the Strategic Intelligence Unit. So maybe if you could tell us a little bit about your role at the University of Melbourne and what you do.
Sure. Unit of Strategic Intelligence looks at the university's relationships with external stakeholders and understanding what those relationships are in terms of value propositions and value creation. So it looks at both internal and external stakeholders, and it's based on vigorous research and both quantitative and qualitative inputs as well.
Yeah, cool. You know, we were just discussing before, I know you've been working in this industry, in the higher education industry now for over 20 years. That you mentioned before previously, you held your role for 16 years at Deakin University. So how have you kind of seen, I guess, the higher education sort of evolve and change over the past, 2 decades working kind of within the industry?
I think the higher education system is evolving, and it could evolve a little bit faster, but it is evolving. And at the end of the day, if they don't evolve, they're going to become irrelevant.
Yeah.
So it's pleasing to see that the universities are morphing. And for example, the pandemic was a big catalyst for some of the changes, for example, going online, whereas I've been doing online education since 2006.
Yeah, wow.
So that's been a long time. But most of the universities got into that kind of technology only after the pandemic. So it has been a big catalyst in some of the changes. But also there are other things that are happening in terms of the type of teaching and learning that takes place in universities, and also cross-pollination between universities and TAFEs that are hoping to happen in the next couple of years, which will be positive.
And do you think that's most of the focus at the moment is around student engagement, and how do you kind of improve? Because there's so much complexities in terms of, how do you kind of meet the students on their own terms? Where's kind of a lot of the energy being put into, as you said, as universities are evolving and morphing? Is that kind of around the student experience and student engagement? What's kind of the main sort of trends, I suppose, where you're seeing that change?
I would say it's a three-pronged approach, George, because it's not just the student engagement. It's also to deal with the value creation. What's the value that's being created by a university, not just to the students, but to society as a whole and its key stakeholders, one of which is the government. So it's a three-pronged approach. So I say that it's a 3-pillar or a triple factor, trifactor. So it's about the students, it's about the community, it's about its stakeholders. So it's about the value creation process for all of those 3 key parts of the system.
Yeah, okay, cool. Very impressive, obviously, looking, at your past experience from a learning point of view. I think you've studied at 8 different kind of universities, both here and abroad, at some very well-renowned global universities. What have you kind of observed, I guess, in terms of, the learning experience here in Australia versus the learning experience, particularly in the US? Obviously, we have more and more students now taking on opportunities to study in the US. What are some of the main kind of trends you see kind of, I guess, between Australia and the US, but also just Australia and other countries?
Sure. That's an interesting question, George, because there is differences, but also it varies between Australian universities as well. For example, Melbourne University or the GO8s and some universities which are highly ranked, they are more focused on impactful research, whereas some of the other universities are well known for their teaching. But not most universities, whereas in the US, I would say they're more about applied research and applied teaching. And I think that's also coming through with some of the Australian universities as well. For example, Melbourne University has a lot of work happening with applied learning, where students actually go out into the communities and learn from businesses and from the community itself. I can give an example. There was a situation where Master of Arts students actually went and project managed an entire community event as part of their assignment. So universities are evolving towards that, particularly the top universities like Melbourne University are moving towards that. Whereas in the US, most universities, that's a norm.
Yeah, okay. I wonder if that kind of is fostered from that, because I think I look at these universities and colleges and just the strength of the groups and this, whether their affinity for their sports teams or whether it's getting behind, as you say, arts and culture, the strength of kind of the student organizations within those US universities seems to be really strong. And I know like that obviously they also exist kind of here in Australia. And I think, speaking with students, a lot of the time that's what people are kind of looking for, particularly international students who are coming here and seeking connection and community. So it's interesting that, you make the point that that's something that you see is kind of evolving and changing kind of here. And I think that kind of makes a lot of sense.
Correct. I also need to make reference to the university's accord, the Oken review. I think that's recommending some key changes as well, which is helping universities in Australia to go to that next level. But interestingly enough, most of the universities are already in the process of embedding some of those recommendations anyway. But it's a very positive welcome.
Yeah, fantastic. And again, I know obviously you've spent time as an academic, you've been tutoring, you've spent time teaching. So how have you been able to kind of, I guess, translate those experiences, both as a learner and, as a mentor and, someone and a professor? How have you been able to kind of transform those experiences kind of into your new role in terms of like strategic partnerships and I guess, that kind of stakeholder management, whether it's students, how have those roles, I guess, come together, in your current role?
So one of the things I want to say here is that the more you learn, you realize how little you know.
Yep.
And when you understand how little you know, the more empathy you have in understanding others' roles. So I guess that comes from the perspective of empathy, understanding the other's position and realizing what's the value that's needed for them. So when I approach a relationship, I look at it from a perspective of what's the value for us as opposed to what's the value for me or the university. So when you come from that perspective, I think you're very open and transparent to listening and growing value as a group as opposed to looking at what's in it for us. So I think that's the approach that I'm taking in terms of my knowledge, my experience. I've realized that, relationships takes years to cultivate.
Totally. Yeah.
And a formal partnership is a result of years of building a relationship together, building trust between both parties, not just one way. And understanding, hey, if we get together, we can create this wonderful thing. But to realize that it takes time. So it's not something that's rushed, and you can't rush relationships either.
And so I guess with that in mind, do you kind of, I'd imagine you sort of have maybe two speeds where you've kind of got those organisations that I'm sure, again, we were speaking recently, organisations like the City of Melbourne, where I'm sure those partnerships have been in place for a very long time and they're built on, as you say, years of trust and understanding and collaboration. I'm assuming you've got, a group of partnerships, obviously that are important at the top end, and then you've got a whole bunch coming through from the kind of ground up. Is that sort of how it works? And if that is the case, how do you go about, forming partnerships with kind of emerging businesses, companies, community organizations, and how do they kind of engage with the university to start that process?
So there are two ways in how an organization can approach. One would be the formal relationship building or the informal relationship building, and then looking at value proposition, which takes time. And that's where you explore possibilities. And a second option is what you call a transactional relationship, transactional partnership, where an organization needs something done or we need something done, and it's just going to be a transactional relationship, and that's it. So there are different ways in how partnerships work. But again, for a person who's brokering the partnership, it's a different context altogether. So they don't necessarily represent the university or the partner. They are an independent body that actually gets the people together with those organizations and then brokers a partnership.
Yeah.
So that's another way of looking at it as well.
What kind of advice would you have to those people who are kind of looking to, grow their network and start to form kind of partnerships across the higher education space?
Sure. Get involved with university events, no matter what university it is. There are open days, there are seminars that are on offer by different universities. Take part in them. Go make yourself known to the key people who are there. Introduce yourself, create your LinkedIn contacts, go meet a few people. And I think that's the starting point. And there are a few instances where I've started relationships using a LinkedIn contact
Yeah.
through an introduction, and that evolved into something much bigger. I can give an example if that's okay.
Yeah,
George.
of course. I would love that.
A couple of years back, when I was at Deakin, I actually brought in 60 assistant and deputy tax commissioners from Sri Lanka for a training program.
Oh, wow.
And this training program, it's a 7-day training program. And some of the key people who came to present in that program were through my LinkedIn networks.
Oh, wow.
So, for example, we had at the time, we had the Inspector General of Tax who came in to talk to this group of people. We had an assistant commissioner from the ATO and similar people who are tax experts and leadership experts and so forth who came and spoke to this group of people.
Amazing.
So that's an example of, networks that you have, the relationship that you have that resulted in something very wonderful in creating value for a broader group of people.
Yeah, I love the saying, it costs nothing to ask. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at is, it doesn't hurt to kind of reach out and put yourself out there. You never know kind of what's on the other side. And often I kind of find with those types of outbound messages as well, it's like sometimes the higher you go, the more likely you are to kind of get a response from someone. Sounds like, you've had a lot of success based on the people that you're talking about there.
Correct.
Would love to kind of tap into your kind of knowledge and your view of both here domestic context as well as international context. You look into, I guess, or you hop into the time machine, or you're looking kind of 20 years ahead. What are some of the things you think are going to be really important to making sure that we evolve in terms of the higher education sector? We evolve to kind of be able to deliver awesome outcomes for students. And how do you kind of see, I guess, in particular university landscape sort of evolving and changing over the next 20 to 30 years?
That's a very interesting question, George, because I think going forward in 20 years' time, we need to consider the implications of AI, artificial intelligence. Yeah. Now, I studied artificial intelligence in my undergrad degree back in 2001.
Wow.
And artificial intelligence has come a long way since then. So we need to take that into consideration. So in terms of how the higher education system or the sector will look in 20 years, I would say there'll be a lot more integration of AI into the individualized and customized teaching of an individual. So personalized learning, I think, is very important. And also, I feel that there will be breaking down of modules of learning or units of learning. Now, one of the things I've always advocated is micro-credential of learning and stackable micro-credentials. I think that will be a big ticket item going forward. For example, at this point in time, there are difficulties in recognizing certain courses in TAFE and university, so that the crossover is not happening as seamlessly as we would like. So if you have this micro-credential in place, so you can then use these stackable micro-credentials anywhere in the world. So for example, if you study in India or Sri Lanka or Australia or UK or US, it doesn't really matter because you're gaining a micro-credential which is stackable. So a couple of stacks of those micro-credentials will lead to a unit would lead to a subject a couple of subjects would lead to some kind of qualification. So it's that cross-pollination that I would see happening. And those micro-credentials will also be customized to recognize what are the gaps in learning individually. For example, the micro-credential itself can be customized to what are the gaps in your knowledge. For example, if I come in as a student, there would be systems that can assess where are my gaps in that particular discipline and customize a micro-credential that is relevant to my personalized learning to meet that minimum threshold of competencies. So in that context, I think AI would play a big role in getting these systems in place and creating this personalized, customized learning and learning anywhere for that matter. In 2010, we did a research project that looked at what we call mobile learning. And that was published in 2012, I think, from memory, that looked at learning of students through iPods at that time. This is going back over a decade. So we looked at students and how they can learn on the run when they're in the gym, when they're on the train, and so forth. So these are the things that I think would happen in far more broader scale going forward. So they can probably learn while they're on the train with virtual glasses.
Yeah.
So these are the things that I probably see happening in the next 20 years. A lot of AI involvement, a lot of cross-pollination, a lot of micro-credentials coming through, and a lot of experiential and applied learning.
Yeah, I think that whole concept of the, education passport where, you talk about micro-credentials, where it's like you can centralize your learning modules, and as you say, you can have a bit of a overview of what have you studied, what's your existing capability, and the ability to kind of move and chop and change. I think, I studied Bachelor of Design. I was fortunate enough to stay the course of my path. I studied something that I really fell in love with and was able to see that out. But a lot of my friends, took very different journeys kind of through their learning experience, and, whether they were going from BCom to switching to arts or whatever. And I know it was like very stop, start, and that was all within kind of the same university. So thinking about trying to do that, across multiple universities, then you've kind of got the whole, the international student market as well. And obviously the ability to have international students to come and experience Australia, but also be able to experience other countries as well, and have that kind of learning acknowledged kind of elsewhere and all connected. I think that's like if we can pull that off, I think that's going to result in much better outcomes kind of for the students.
Absolutely. And you can see that Melbourne University or the University of Melbourne is actually leading this way in certain areas. For example, Melbourne Business School and MSpace, which is part of the University of Melbourne, actually pioneer in some of these areas of micro-credentialing and bespoke learning, which is customized learning and so forth. So I think from that perspective, there are a couple of other universities as well, and not just the University of Melbourne, that actually are doing this very successfully at the moment, but there's still a long way to go. Yeah.
And I think that whole, again, as we go deeper into, the personalized learning journey and kind of more of the content, I guess, being delivered on a, whether it's a phone, computer, whatever, being delivered digitally, I think the importance of kind of the experiential environment where, you're kind of putting the skills to practice and like the practical skills is going to become increasingly important as well, because it's like we're going to go hard in terms of, more of the learning experience happening digitally to deliver a better outcome, because, to enable that personalization. But I think at the same time, the kind of experiential in-person learning is going to become, hopefully become even better, but certainly become kind of more important kind of the deeper we go in terms of leveraging technology to deliver learning.
Absolutely, George. There are a couple of other things to understand as well in this context. There is a significant difference between face-to-face teaching, hybrid teaching, and online learning or online teaching. They have to be treated very differently because the approach that you use for each of those different types of teaching is very different. And I think a lot of people may not necessarily appreciate the efforts that go into designing these different types of engagements. So fully online teaching requires a completely different skill set. A hybrid approach, again, a different skill set. I'm a big fan of the hybrid approach, to be very honest, because it gets the best of both worlds, the online as well as the face-to-face. And it also creates that opportunity to engage with your fellow peers and also have that time off to be more productive in learning at your own pace. So I think that's a really good way to go. And I feel that that kind of approach will get a bit more prominence in years to come.
Totally agree. Well, thank you so much, Luckmika. It's been wonderful having you join us for a conversation. Really look forward to tracking what you do next and learning more about the role and all the wonderful things you're kind of doing here in Australia and abroad as well. So thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, George. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Cheers.